All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom, and this is part 2 of my conversation with Jonathan Abrams. We talk more about the evils, is that right, of entrepreneurship, of venture capital. We also talk about women in tech in this podcast because people love when two men talk about women in tech. Jonathan actually has some good points, and he is on the board of Girls in Tech, an organization doing some good things here in Silicon Valley. And at the very end, we delve into a little bit about what else. TV, sci-fi books. This is the Something Venture podcast. Thanks for listening. Well, this is my constant observation about Silicon Valley is people, it just seems like it's maybe all businesses are like this, but it's sort of the most delusional group of people. Like people who are VPs at companies think they can go and just run an independent company as CEO. If you're a VP at a company that's been around for 30, you're there, you're not there on any given day, the company's going to run. Like if you're not Larry and Sergey in the early days, Google was going to run, whether you were on the AdWords team or not. You come to a startup, if you're not at the startup, it's not going to happen. Like if you're not driving every single day. And so people kind of think they can do it, and they come in, and then it's almost become a joke, right? The new CEO comes in, and the next thing you know, like the stock is down, and then there are 3 CEOs in all of a sudden, and it happens almost the same way every single time.
Well, there's a great risk of changing CEOs at any company. Yeah. Even if the founder's not doing a good job, even if you find a great new person to be CEO, it doesn't always work out. It's really hard. Yeah. And the venture capitalists and the headhunters get paid a lot of money to do their jobs, and if you are trying to provide value add on being on 10 plus boards at once,
right?
Bringing in an incredibly impressive CEO is a very highly leveraged use of your time. It's something where you're making a big impact as a board member,
right?
So it's a very highly leveraged use of your time, and the reality is you don't really have time. I don't know how anybody could have time to be really adding value to 10 or 20 companies at once. Anybody.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a very high impact kind of thing to do. But the reality is, I think it's just really risky, and people forget how many unsuccessful.
Yeah.
And it's not like I'm against ever bringing in hired CEOs. I mean, there's companies I'm an angel investor in that have done that, and it's worked out well. Yeah. But it's still I think there's this assumption that we're finding the founder, a world-class partner, and we've brought in this big shot famous person with a fancy resume and cheers all around.
Yeah.
But the reality is, what is the chance of it succeeding?
Yeah.
Probably less than 50% on average. But it's it's the kind of thing that if you do, everybody's going to issue the press release, get a lot of congratulatory tweets, but rolling up your sleeves and helping a founding CEO who's struggling stay but improve, that's a lot more work. And it's not something anybody's going to know you're doing. You're not going to get cheers and accolades for it. It's kind of going to be a long slog, not necessarily so fun.
Yeah. Well, then this is one of my Silicon Valley lessons to young entrepreneurs. I think one of the funny things, I do this podcast, I imagine young entrepreneurs listen to it and learn stuff. But then I realize when I talk to young entrepreneurs, that's one of the things they tend not to do. They tend not to, they're like, yeah, I'm sure. Whatever, old dude, it's not true.
I don't know. It's kind of funny that we've got so much more information than ever before.
Yeah.
But there's this weird thing that seems some people just don't even seem to be interested in it.
Or people don't believe me. We heard of famous VC was here speaking recently. I think someone we respect. And he was talking about the VCs in the Valley he liked. And he was like, well, 80% of them, 20% of them don't harm you. Don't harm you. Not help you or say, wait. So you're saying 80% of VCs are causing damage to their companies?
I think it might even be worse. I remember who you're talking about. I won't name the name, but I remember. Yeah, this was somebody who's a very respected guy at a well-known VC firm he was basically saying that most of the other VCs are the only very small number he thinks are actually good, which of course and if I said that, I'd get a lot of angry tweets from my VC friends.
Right.
But many VCs actually think that. Most of them don't say it.
But think of how astonishing that is, though, to say that about and none of the smart people in the room were like, no, that doesn't make sense. Everyone's like, yeah, maybe it's 85, maybe it's 80, 75. And and this happened to me at Friendster when the VCs came in, I was like, oh, they must know what they're doing.
Well, in any industry,
not really.
In any industry, any industry. I mean, one of the things that I've learned, a painful lesson, was that like every lawyer is not interchangeable. There are lawyers who do, who are good and lawyers who are bad, and that's true of doctors, software engineers. It's true of everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just normal. That's not a surprise.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that I think young entrepreneurs miss is VCs are not on your side. Like they really appear like they're on your side, but they're really not. Like they have a very specific thing that they're trying to accomplish and very specific other people they're trying to impress, and they're on your side exactly as long as you're doing really well. But they can also look like a genius to their partners firing you and like get praised and paid more for doing that.
There's a lot of noise now being pro-founder, pro-entrepreneur, and then it's usually mixed up with a lot of other things that like too high valuations that have nothing really to do with that. In terms of alignment between entrepreneurs and investors, I think you're right that there are differences in the alignment. And people like Y Combinator and Venture Hacks and AngelList have tried to explain that.
Yeah.
And a lot of venture investors don't really want to sort of focus on that. There's a bit of disingenuous stuff. And I think it's better off for everybody if everybody just understands what the deal is going into it with eyes wide open. And some venture investors will say, we like work for the founders. And I've always said, yeah, that's not really true. And I don't really know why we have to pretend that's the case. I mean, the reality is you're professional money managers. You work for the investors in your firm. You work for the LPs, and that's okay.
Right.
Now, hopefully you're going to treat the entrepreneurs you're working with great respect. But when you say they're the customers, no, they're not really the customers.
Right.
I mean, I think the customers are the people whose money that you're managing. As venture investors, of course, you should try to have the trust and respect of entrepreneurs to get the best opportunities to invest in the best companies.
Right.
But the idea that the entrepreneurs, you work for them or they're customers, I kind of think it's a disingenuous exaggeration that's not really necessary. I think it's okay to be honest about how the system really works. Yeah. And I think the alignment between investors and founders could be improved. My personal sort of impression has been that these newer firms that you and I are big fans of, the Softecs and Lower Cases and Home Brews and Data Collectives, I kind of feel that these firms, because they're newer, because the people running them are more entrepreneurial themselves, and because they're smaller, are just typically a bit more aligned, because the huge firms have some mathematical challenges, and then probably they have more politics and sort of firm sort of internal dysfunction and things like that can bleed over and affect entrepreneurs in ways that an inexperienced entrepreneur is never even going to probably anticipate. Right. One interesting thing, there was a paper I read from, I think it was a Berkeley Law School professor that pointed out that the whole way, and as you said, Microsoft, they took venture capital after they'd been around for a long time. I mean, things have not always been this way, and the whole industry is in a lot of flux now. We've got crowdfunding and AngelList syndicates and a lot of new things going on. But the sort of status quo for the last 10, 20 years, a lot of it was the founders being pushed out, but a lot of it also was the venture investors controlling the boards, and that of course is not what happened at Facebook. That's why this company didn't have 6 CEOs in 6 years. But in many cases, at venture-backed startups, the investors end up in control of the board and so in control of the company, but they also have preferred shares, which give them all sorts of protections that were actually designed in corporate law to protect minority shareholders. Right. And this paper from this law school professor, I think it was Jesse Fried, pointed out that was actually kind of a weird thing, kind of a weird, unprecedented thing in the history of corporate law, that having the investors essentially control the company by really dominating the board, whether it's officially or whether it's because the so-called independent outsiders are going to go along with the investors, and then also have the liquidation preferences and all those other protections, is kind of weird, and it probably is imbalanced. And I think that if if the venture investors have all the protections, which they should have, like liquidation preferences, I think they probably shouldn't be in control of the board. And I actually don't think it necessarily benefits them.
Right.
I think that, that you invest in portfolio companies, and hopefully the founders and entrepreneurs you chose to work with, most of them do a good job. And because, they don't make money if you don't. The common shares do not become worth something if the preferred shares end up being worthless.
Right.
But the ideas of, controlling these, so the board really controlling the company and driving the investors driving the company and pushing out the entrepreneurs, there's a lot of examples of why that, I think, doesn't work as well. So, I think most venture investors would be better off not trying to do that.
Yeah. It's also kind of consequence free too. These guys come in, replace CEOs, company goes out of business. There's like no consequence. Like nobody comes back to them. There's no fiduciary there's supposed to be, but the bar on that is so high.
Yeah, the business judgment rule says that as a board member, you have a fiduciary duty of care and loyalty. But if you make a reasonable business decision, then you're typically not liable to any exposure. And if you as a venture investor vote to hire an incredibly experienced business person to be the new CEO of a company, of course that there's nothing that looks ridiculous about that.
Right.
That's on the face of it, a smart decision.
Yeah, you replaced a 25-year-old with a 43-year-old executive from Oracle. It just sounds smart.
It sounds very reasonable.
Yeah.
It sounds very reasonable. But unfortunately, many times that means the entrepreneurs are actually going to end up leaving the company.
Yeah.
And that's end up actually going to be a problem. Yeah. And then oftentimes the new hired CEOs don't work out. Yeah. And then you've seen, so at Friendster, we had 6 CEOs in 6 years.
Yep.
At Yahoo, at Hewlett-Packard, a lot of companies where you've seen a bizarre shuffling of CEOs in a short period. And some of those companies have had some of the most famous investors on their boards.
Yeah. What's your advice to the young entrepreneur? I think I know what mine is as I've talked to people. It's kind of like, don't do it. Like for most of them.
Don't become an entrepreneur.
Yeah. For most people.
I wouldn't actually encourage somebody to do it. Yeah. So I've spent my whole time in Silicon Valley on the advisory board of the Silicon Valley Association of Software Entrepreneurs, mentoring at Steve Blank's entrepreneurship class, running Founders Day, doing a lot of things where I've tried to help other entrepreneurs to give back. But I probably wouldn't encourage somebody to become a founder because the likelihood of success is so low.
Yeah. Well, there's a really fun. Maybe I dreamed up this blog post, but because I can't find it. But this guy wrote this article about the perceived percentages and actual in different phases of venture cap, fundraising. So, the entrepreneur has coffee with a VC and it goes well. He's like, oh, there's like a 20% chance I'm going to get funded, and the actual percentage is like 0. And then he goes on, and eventually he meets with the partners. He's like, I'm certainly going to get funded. They're like, it's 50-50. And then he gets the term sheet. He's like, and no, you're still at like only a 70% chance.
Yeah, I do remember that blog post. A lot of VCs take a lot of meetings, like a lot.
Yeah, if you do the math, if they do 10 investments a year, five a year.
So if you're doing seed, you're doing more investments. But if you're doing Series A, you're doing much less than that. Yeah,
so say you're doing 3 deals a year, but you're having, breakfast, lunch, dinner, coffee. You're taking 10 meetings, 8 meetings a day.
Yeah. No, there's some venture investors who probably look at, on average, 10 things a day in some way or another.
Yeah.
So the statistics, and then, of course, the funny thing is, every single company I founded has raised multiple rounds of funding.
Yeah.
Every one of them has been venture backed. And, and of course we know that most venture backed companies do not become hugely successful.
Right.
And even if the company actually is in some way successful, what's even worse is the likelihood of the founders, as well as the early team, who all have early common shares, of getting any proceeds in an eventual exit are very low, because companies, a lot of times, companies have problems, and I think sometimes bringing in the new CEO exacerbates those problems sometimes.
Yeah.
And then a lot of times these venture-backed companies, maybe they go through a recap, or they eventually have an exit that is unfortunately mathematically too low based on the capital they've raised, and the liquidation preferences take all of it. And maybe there's a carve-out for the management team that's in place 7 years later at the time of selling the company. But a lot of times, even when the company there is actually, it's not a failure. This company gets bought for $100 million by somebody.
Right.
But that still doesn't mean that the people who really worked really hard as the early team may see $1 of proceeds from that. That's not great, and I wouldn't necessarily encourage people to do it. But I remember that blog post you're talking about, and a lot of venture investors, they take a lot of meetings, they look at a lot of things. There's probably some who maybe they're very experienced, they have a lot of network and relationships, and they take a more opportunistic approach. But I think there are a lot of folks who just take a lot of meetings, so entrepreneurs probably overestimate, at each phase. But even if you do manage to be the very few that get funded, then your chance of having your shares in your company ever be worth anything, pretty tough.
I guess it's like the lottery. Like people think there's 10% chance they're going to win, and there's actually it's
almost like a lottery within a lottery. I mean, it's like the chance of you getting funding from a Santa Road VC. So they get pitched 10 things a day and they invest in 3 a year. I mean, the math of that is brutal. So then you win the lottery and you get funded, and you're in TechCrunch, and you're like, oh my God, this is so cool. And your friends think, oh, you're cool, you're a founder, whatever. But then, you've gotten that through that lottery. Now there's another lottery before your common shares end up being worth, a dime.
Yeah, the venture capitalist Josh Hanna at Matrix. He's like, if you're trying to maximize your wealth in Silicon Valley, the winning strategy is actually, in his opinion, take any job you can get at a rocket ship. Be the assistant to the assistant general counsel at Google, or at Facebook or Twitter. And I realize the people I know like that do really well. It's because, one, there's more of those jobs, so they can go get a job at Google. And then if the assistant general counsel at Google quits, who cares? They can just, if it's not working out, they just go to the next one. Whereas if you're the CEO, you can't just kind of quit when, Uber makes you an offer.
That's true, and it's probably good advice. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, Wealthfront, I think it was the Wealthfront blog, once had a post with sort of their advice on this. Maybe it was one of the founders or something, and they similarly said, don't go to work at a seed stage startup or a Series A startup or a Series B startup. And don't today go and work at Google today, but basically go to the companies in between. So it'd be Slack or Uber.
Right.
Not Google or Facebook, because the reality is your likelihood of...
It's happened.
Well, those companies are huge now, and you're just not going to get that much being, the millionth person at one of those companies. But, Uber, Slack, some company like that's still way beyond Series A, that obviously is just killing it.
Yeah.
That, and then go to a company like that for 2 years. And then if because sometimes there are companies that look like that, and it ends up being, one of these fallen unicorns.
Yeah.
So, if it ends up, unfortunately, not being the big success that it should be, then go to another one in 2 years. So in 10 years, you'd have, been at 5, worst case, but probably one of them actually ended up being very successful in one IPO, and you stay there for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not bad advice at all.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, I talk about women on the podcast a lot, because people like when two men talk about women issues. They find it really useful. I've actually found it's been immensely interesting, though, because I kind of came into this thinking, well, obviously we don't commit any abuses or discrimination when it comes to women. And if you're a guy, doesn't happen to you. So you kind of go, oh, these things kind of don't really happen in Silicon Valley. And then as I've talked to different women on my podcast, they're like, dude, you have no idea. And so I had something interesting happen to me today. And I was thinking about women in tech, but I was going to ask you how you learned to code. I was listening to the radio coming in, and they were talking about this 14-year-old kid who had created a kind of an emoji that makes sound, but they're like, it was a 14-year-old. And so then they interviewed the kid, and it was a girl. And I was like, it just didn't even occur to me. I was just expecting to be some little nerdy 14-year-old boy. I wasn't trying to be biased, but
you were.
Yeah, when the girl's voice came out, I was like, well, why wouldn't it? Why wouldn't it be a girl?
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that's interesting is like, so why aren't there more women engineers and all of that? And then you get into encouraging people to be engineers in school. But that's not how it happened for all the people who are engineers today, right? Like when I was in school, the people who became engineers were off. It's not like they're like all the boys were encouraged to go play sports and things like that. But it wasn't like there was something that was encouraging male. It was they went off into Dungeons and Dragons and read weird sci-fi and kind of went in their bedroom.
I was probably discouraged from my interest in computers.
Right. So
I think, my family, my teachers really wanted me to be, also be interested in sports and the things that I wasn't interested in.
Yeah. So the narrative where you encourage people to code, I don't know. I haven't like quite figured out like if that is if the narrative of how people learn to code is rewritten or like what. I don't know.
Well, I think there's these debates about what are the challenges in getting more gender diversity in the tech industry. And they're always like, well, is it this versus this? And the reality is it's all of them.
Right.
So when people defend their lack of diversity by complaining about the pipeline, and then people are like, okay, it's not just the pipeline, dude. Right. The fact that, that these VC firms are dominated by like Stanford Business School grads. Guess what? You go and you speak at Stanford Business School, and actually their class is like more than half women. So the fact that there's so few women in the venture industry is, it's not just a pipeline issue.
Right.
But it's not an either or. So there are issues with pipeline. There are issues with encouragement. There's issues with discouragement. There's issues with harassment, and there's issues with bias. It's all of those things. Yeah. It's not just one. So the debate is kind of irrelevant. The question really is, for every one of those, what can be done to improve every part of that?
Yeah.
And I think there is a lot going on. In some ways, it's surprising like how little progress has been made. Because like when I was in like student government and engineering in college, which is like, I don't want to admit how long ago, this was, the gender issues were big back then. Of course, the guys in engineering and computer science were bummed at how few women were
right.
In their class. I mean, the reality is if you're, guy in college, you'd, really
right.
like it if there were,
right.
if it wasn't, so many guys. So then there was something we talked about, and, that was a long time ago, and obviously not much improvement has been made since then. But at the same time, there do seem, there's all sorts of organizations now trying to address this. So as you probably know, I'm on the board of Girls in Tech. Yep. There's a bunch of others that are doing things. And there's also a lot of stuff teaching kids to code. And the reality is, even if the, white and Asian boys somehow more gravitated to it, that still doesn't, seemingly on their own, that still doesn't really mean that there wasn't things going on that sort of made that easier for some groups but not others.
I just feel like it was literally just, it's like the Starbucks, where people kind of, Starbucks was the first of that type of company. They came to the US and then little mom and pops started, and now like people kind of think that maybe Starbucks replaced the mom and pops. Like they didn't. Like the guys who coded, I think kind of did that, at least maybe this is even earlier than most people. They did it kind of like Steve Jobs probably wasn't encouraged. Well, he wasn't really a coder, but like Bill Gates and guys like that were.
Well, here's a question. Just like you had that sort of, sort of unfortunate bias, assuming that this kid who invented this thing on the radio was going to be a boy. Okay. How many girls have maybe had some interest in something like that, but then didn't get encouragement?
Yeah.
That they did show an interest in computers, or electronics, or math, or whatever, and then got some sort of signal.
Yeah.
Maybe even a subtle signal from a parent or teacher or somebody, 10 years or 20 years ago or whatever, that discouraged it.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it.
Right.
I think also, sitting at a computer all day long is kind of a bit of a isolated, nerdy thing. And, I think women are expected to be less antisocial than men.
That's interesting.
And if you're a very smart young woman, you have a lot of choices. You're good at math and logic. You could be a doctor or lawyer, investment banker, a lot of very prestigious opportunities. And if the image that you have of working in the software industry is, sitting at a computer all day long and then being annoyed by a bunch of, inept nerds, that's not necessarily very attractive.
Yeah.
So, I think there's problems at every point of it. I'm an advisor to Code Now, which teaches kids to code, and it specifically targets kids that are from the sort of underrepresented backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And that includes minorities, but the percent usually in these classes is usually 50% female. Yep. So there's a lot going on, and I think, it's pretty exciting, some of the things that are going on, but it's a complex issue.
Yeah. What, I say for the end, like I usually talk about BS stuff at the beginning of the podcast, but I'm talking for nearly an hour. But we talk about sci-fi books a lot. What are some of your favorites?
I think we talk about TV shows even more.
Oh, yeah. What are some of the like great TV shows? TV is great right now.
Well, you know me, I'm a TV nerd, so I've always thought TV was great. Yeah. Probably even when it wasn't. Like some of the TV shows that I remember fondly, and of course, I was also young, but some of the shows that I liked as a kid are not necessarily Breaking Bad or House of Cards. I mean, I liked Knight Rider and Alf and the A-Team, and I thought they were great.
Those are fantastic shows.
Well, it's subjective, right?
Yeah, like once in a while I meet people in Silicon Valley, like people are really full of it. But like, I don't have a TV.
I don't have a TV.
It's like really, you sit at home reading Proust or something. Like, come on.
There are people like that. Some of them are probably telling the truth. Some of them are probably posturing. But
like House of Cards, these are fabulous shows. Like these are better than
But to say you don't have a TV anymore is actually kind of meaningless, because it used to be that you didn't have a TV meant you didn't watch TV shows, and maybe you watched some DVDs of some highbrow movies. Yeah. But now a lot of people don't bother to have a TV or cable, but they have a laptop or an iPad and Netflix or Amazon, and they're watching House of Cards or maybe the HBO Go. They're watching Game of Thrones. Yeah. So a lot of young people are watching TV. They're just not doing it on a TV.
Right. Yeah, it's, to me, it's kind of like saying you don't read books. It's like, well, whatever. Like, you're watching.
The funny thing is, most Americans don't read books.
I think, yeah.
So, here in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, we live in a kind of a ridiculous thing where, completely. Everybody is like, acts like they're this type A person who's on 10 boards while they're doing a triathlon, and they're interested in the arts and this and that and all that kind of stuff. So, a lot of people maybe say they don't watch TV. But, in America at large, I think most Americans don't read books.
I guess that's true. So people should be watching the Goldbergs for sure.
Well, I think...
I guess if you're of a certain age, it makes no sense.
I don't know if everybody would enjoy that show. Yeah. I mean, if you grew up in the 80s...
It just has nostalgia for the 80s, which were kind of...
Absolutely. Well, I think in general, it's a great show. I mean, I think the actress that plays the mom is brilliant.
She's great.
And pretty much all the other characters are great, too. And the dad was from Curb Your Enthusiasm, Jeff Garlin.
Right.
I mean, it is a great cast, and it's a great show. But if you didn't grow up in the 80s, you may not quite be as fanatic about it as we are.
It's kind of funny. It's like when technology was just really clunky. Mm-hmm. And they'll have like graphics that they're just like horrible square boxes.
Well, my one pet peeve is when they show the home videos they're supposedly making on like a VHS camcorder. Yeah. It's not as scratchy, as staticky as it should be.
Oh yeah.
But yes, when they pull out some sort of Nintendo, Commodore, type of technology from the 80s, it's pretty funny.
And they can't believe like how amazing the graphics are, which I have to admit, like I was more amazed. Like now when you come up with some VR thing or something like that, I'm like, that's pretty cool. Back when I logged into whatever the CompuServe and got onto some BBS, I was much more amazed by it. I was like, wow, like I'm logged into a server and...
Yeah, but you were also younger.
That's true.
And more excited. Now we're older and more jaded.
Yeah, right.
So,
Yeah, you can deliver lunch to my door with an app, whatever.
Look, everybody, you and I in Silicon Valley right now is very excited about, virtual reality.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. I guess a lot of people live in places you don't want to be in.
Maybe.
So virtual reality could change that.
Well, not everybody is lucky enough to live in San Francisco.
Yeah.
But yeah, Goldbergs is great. I love that show.
Rick and Morty, fabulous.
Rick and Morty is one of my new favorites. And probably most of the people who listen to your podcast would probably like Rick and Morty.
I'd never heard of it.
Yeah, I think I discovered it because some VC, I can't remember if it was Mark Andreessen, Chris Sacca, but somebody I think was mentioned it on Twitter. And it is a cartoon that's not for children. It's a little bit like Futurama, but I think quite better. I think it's from the guy who did Community. And it's about a sort of a mad scientist who drags his sort of hapless grandson along on a lot of adventures. And it very cleverly satirizes the whole sci-fi genre, time travel, alternate dimensions, space. It's really funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's fabulous. I don't know. It's like a golden era of TV right now. That's why I do all these podcasts like on tech and issues in tech. And then I interviewed one guy who works in the TV industry. And everyone just loves that podcast. They're like, oh, that's how reality TV gets made.
Well, I think it just proves that, Hollywood is less nerdy than Silicon Valley. And that was one of my favorite of your podcasts because it's about something that I am interested in. Of course, I watch TV shows and and of which I actually don't know much.
Yeah.
I don't know the ins and outs of that industry. So it's fascinating to me, versus hearing another some other more, Silicon Valley, generic insider stuff. Yeah. So that was one of my favorite of your podcasts. I thought it was interesting.
So we'll finish with that. What are your favorite sci-fi books?
Sci-fi books? Well,
that's another thing too. Like
old or new?
Old.
Or both. Old?
Are there good new ones?
Well, we were just talking about Beggars in Spain from Nancy Kress.
Fantastic.
Actually, I was just. I can't remember who, but somebody in our industry was just talking to me about that book. I can't remember whether it was via Facebook, email, or Twitter about how it's underrated. But actually, I think it won the Hugo, and I think Nancy Kress won both the Hugo and Nebula, so she's certainly not a unknown writer.
Right.
But she's not, Christopher Nolan acquire the rights to that book and turn it into the next Memento or Interstellar or great movie.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I read Mark Andreessen. Do all tech guys read sci-fi?
Not everybody. And actually, it's kind of funny because he hasn't updated it recently. I think he now has a family now. But a few years ago, Mark Andreessen wrote a list of science fiction book recommendations with a lot of British authors. Yeah, and actually, a lot of the people on his list were people who, now it seems like everybody knows, but I didn't know, and I ended up, Charles Stross and Salzi.
I found a lot of his list tough. Like he had a lot of tough ones on. Like he had one that was good, but it wasn't that good. It was just good because the guy had kind of predicted the internet.
I actually remember. I think I read most of everything on that list, and it was all pretty good stuff.
And I thought Accelerando was just tough to keep up with.
Yeah, that was kind of a crazy book, but still great.
My recommendation is Ringworld and Ringworld Engineers.
Those are classics. Yeah. As you and I were discussing, why haven't those been made into a movie?
It's I don't know.
Although that Matt Damon movie sort of stole it.
Elysium stole Ringworld.
Sort of stole it, yeah.
Okay, so Beggars in Spain and Ringworld.
That's a classic.
If you get one thing out of the podcast, read those books.
One of my new recommendations, which I think you enjoyed, was Lexicon.
That was
that was the one about the poets. Remember this?
Yeah.
Now that was a very interesting book, and actually, it's not about time travel. Nope. It's not about magic elves. This is a book that if you're in Silicon Valley, if you're interested in influence and persuasion, and memes and marketing and language and that kind of stuff, which a lot of people here are, they'd probably find that one pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
And of course, Ready Player One.
Oh wait, okay. Read Ready Player One, then read Lexicon, then read Beggars in Spain. I forgot about that.
And that one, I think a lot of San Francisco people would probably like that book. It was something like Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, something like that.
That's great too.
And that's a fun one.
Yeah.
And it's it's got a lot of sort of San Francisco, Silicon Valley
it takes
references.
place in Berkeley or something, right?
I think it takes place at a bookstore. I think it was in San Francisco, wasn't it? I think it was in San Francisco, or maybe Berkeley. And then it's got some stuff at Google.
Yeah.
That's a really fun one.
Yeah. All right. Well, have we done this thing?
I thought we were going to go for another hour. We haven't.
Oh yeah.
I thought we haven't gotten controversial enough. You said some really mean things about Donald Trump that you wanted to say.
Oh no, I'm a big fan of this podcast is going to be out there for a long time, so I'm a big fan of Mr. Trump's in case he's the president.
Should we memorialize a bet right now? That I'm going to bet that he does not become the president of the United States.
I don't want to bet against that. I think he's going to win the nomination.
Could be.
Here's my thing about Donald Trump is I'm just observing the chessboard. People have predicted like 20 times in a row he's not going to go to the next step.
Yeah.
So now I've got to believe that the 21st time in a row he won't go to the final step.
Yeah, I mean, if we look back, the fact that Sarah Palin was even the VP, that if they had won, that ticket had won, she would have been a heartbeat away from the nuclear codes. In retrospect, that was almost as crazy as the idea of Donald Trump being the Republican nominee.
Well, the Economist, just pretty well respected publication, just listed their top 10 risk factors for the next year, and Donald Trump's presidency is one of them, like global risk factors, like a recession in China, and Donald Trump actually becomes president. Someone pointed out to me like that maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor of California at the time. That was like a joke. That was never going to happen.
That was something when that happened, and we live in California, that I thought was bizarre. Yeah. And I don't think I had become an American citizen yet. I don't think I could vote, but I remember thinking that was just weird. And I was, a fan of his movies, but I thought that was just, the California, if it was a country, would still be like one of the highest GDPs in the world. That was surprising. And in the end, he probably wasn't that bad.
Well, and that
could have been a lot worse.
That was the second lesson.
It wasn't as bad as we probably were worried.
Yeah. So I guess I'll bet. I don't really hope this doesn't happen, but Donald Trump will be president.
Well, I don't think he's.
I don't think so either. I think.
But it is crazy stuff.
Yeah, it is. Well, may you live in interesting times, and we certainly do.
We certainly do.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for finally inviting me. I've been waiting for years to be on this podcast.
Now I can have you back. As you know, people come back to the podcast, so
okay,
come back and we'll figure something else out. Talk about something else.
Okay, maybe me and Michael White can do it together.
That would be great.
Michael White is, of course, one of my favorite recurring characters on the Something Ventured podcast.
Yeah, he's always got something to say.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks so much. This has been the Something Ventured podcast with Jonathan Abrams. Thanks for listening.